That was demonstrated in September 1999 when Bill Clinton, under very extensive domestic and international pressure, finally decided to call it off. He didn't have to bomb Jakarta. He didn't have to impose an embargo. He just told the Indonesian generals the game's over, and they immediately withdrew. That goes down in history as a great humanitarian intervention. That's not exactly the right story. Right up until then, the United States was continuing to support the atrocities. Britain, under its new ethical foreign policy, didn't quite get in on time, and they kept supporting them even after the Australian-led UN peacekeeping force entered. Well, that's NATO 10 years ago. It's even putting aside the claims about Serbia, which maybe a word about those are worthwhile. We know what happened in Serbia. There's a massive, in Kosovo, there's massive documentation from the State Department, from NATO, European Union observers on the ground. There was a level of atrocities sort of distributed between the guerrillas and the Serbs, but it was expected that the NATO bombing would radically increase the atrocities, which it did. If you look back at the Milosevic indictment in the middle of the bombing, almost entirely about atrocities, except for one exception, about atrocities after the NATO bombing. That's what they anticipated. General Clark and commanding general had informed Washington weeks earlier, yes, that would be the consequence. He informed the press of that as the bombing started. That was the humanitarian intervention, while NATO was supporting even worse atrocities right within NATO, in East Timor, and go on in other cases. Well, that's NATO 10 years ago. And it begins to tell us what NATO is for. Is it for defending Europe from attack? In fact, there is such a pretense now. So when President Bush started installing missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, the claim was, well, this is to defend Europe from attack against Iranian nuclear-tipped missiles. In fact, that doesn't have any, doesn't matter. And the fact that if it had any, it would be total insanity for them to even arm one, because the country would be vaporized in 30 seconds. And it's a threat to Russia again, just like Clinton's expansion of NATO to the east.
France joining?
Pardon?
France joining now, rejoining?
France joining is quite interesting. I mean, France had a policy initiated by General de Gaulle of trying to turn Europe into what was then called a third force, independent of the two superpowers. So Europe should pursue an independent course. It was, he spoke of Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. That was a great fear of the United States since the Second World War, that Europe would strike out on its own after reconstructing, which it could. The economies on the scale of the United States, no reason, except in military force, it's comparable to the United States. So it could have been a move towards a peaceful Europe, independent of the superpowers. In fact, a large part of the purpose of NATO was to prevent that from happening, to ensure that Europe would stay within the U.S. umbrella, under U.S. control. Well, France has now abandoned that position and has rejoined what is now just an intervention force, an international intervention force, exactly as James Jones and Hoopcheffer and others portray it. It's an international intervention force under U.S. command. Why should it exist? In fact, if you go back to 1989 and 1990, it's extremely interesting to see how the United States reacted to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which 20 years ago, which signaled the end of the Soviet Union clearly, the Bush administration, Bush 1, immediately released a national security strategy, a military budget, and so on, which are very interesting reading. What they say, in effect, is everything's going to go on exactly as before, but with new pretexts. So now we have to have a huge military establishment and military budget, and not to protect ourselves from the Russians who are collapsing, but because, literally, because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. Now that was promulgated without ridicule. if someone was watching from Mars, they'd collapse in laughter. So because of the technological sophistication of third world powers, we have to keep this huge military budget. We have to keep intervention forces aimed at the Middle East, the main target of intervention. Why? Not because of the Russians. It said, as had been claimed, what it said was we have to direct the intervention forces to the Middle East, where our problems could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. So in other words, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but now the clouds have lifted, so we just have to have intervention forces aimed at the Middle East, because we have to control it. We have to maintain what they called the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism for high technology industry. That's why you have things like computers and the internet and so on. So that's the massive state sector of the high-tech economy. We have to maintain that, again, because of the threat of the third world and so on. In other words, everything remains the same. The pretext change. That passed without a whisper.
Noam Chomsky, I want to get to Afghanistan. It's the main topic of NATO. It's debate around the issue of the expansion of war in Afghanistan at President Obama's initiative is not the main topic of debate in the United States, meaning whether or not we should be doing this. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting. It is the topic of discussion in the United States, right in the middle of the establishment. So Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, had an interesting article probably 6 months ago, or roughly, by two of the leading specialists on Afghanistan, Barnett Rubin and Ahmed Rashid. And their basic point was that the United States should give up the idea that military victory is the answer to everything. They said that the United States should reorient its policy so that there would be a regional solution in which the concerned countries, that includes crucially Iran, but also India, Russia, China, would themselves work out a regional settlement, and that the Afghans should work something out among themselves. They pointed out correctly that the regional countries are not happy about having a NATO military center based in Afghanistan. It's obviously a threat to them. Now, this is not what's being done. There's some gestures towards, maybe some undersecretary will say hello to an Iranian representative or something. But that's not the core of the policy that's being pursued. Now, that, side by side with that, is something else that's been happening. There is a significant peace movement in Afghanistan. Exactly its scale, we don't know. But it's enough so that Pamela Constable of the Washington Post, in a recent article in Afghanistan, argued that when the new American troops come, they're going to face two enemies, the Taliban and public opinion, meaning the peace movement whose slogan is put down the weapons and we don't mind if you're here, but for aid and development. We don't want any more fighting. In fact, we know from Western-run polls that about 75% of Afghans are in favor of negotiations among Afghans. Now, that includes the Taliban, who are Afghans. In fact, it even includes the ones in Pakistan. There's the difference. The really troubled areas now are Pashtun areas, which are split by a British-imposed line, artificial line called the Durand Line, which was imposed by the British to protect British India, expanded, and they've never accepted it. It just cuts their territory in half. Afghanistan, when it was a functioning state, never accepted it, right through the 1970s. But certainly the Afghan Taliban are Afghans, and President Karzai, formerly our man, no longer, because he's just getting out of control.
How? How is he getting out of control?
In interesting ways. When President Obama was elected, Afghan President Karzai sent him a message, which as far as I know was unanswered, in which he pleaded with President Obama to stop killing Afghans. He also addressed a UN delegation and told them he wanted a timetable for the removal of foreign forces. Well, his popularity quickly plummeted. he used to be very much praised for his nice clothes and great demeanor, and very much admired by the media and commentators. Now he's sunk very low. He's suddenly corrupt and so on.
You mean in the